We invest our careers in developing projects in science, and the way these projects in science then have value for our scientific colleagues is often through publishing in an international journal. If we design a strong project and we write the project well, then we can share it in a very effective way with the scientific community at large. Today I'd like to talk about how we might design our scientific projects so that we can write about them and have this combination of strong projects and strong writing come together to form a publication for a journal. As you read the literature yourself, you probably find some papers are much more useful to you than other papers. So we might start by asking what makes a paper interesting and useful to you when you're a reader. Well, one area that's a favorite of many of us is a research project that deals with our favorite location or our favorite topic. Another study might be a new idea that I could use perhaps in my own research or my own practice. A third possibility would be a study that explains forest dynamics in many different places, because that would empower me to understand forests much more broadly. And these studies that explain forests in many places might be a large regional study that help explain the forests of a particular mountain range, such as the Himalayas here in Asia. Or it could be a review of many studies where people have done smaller research projects in different locations, but now the review paper pulls all that together so that I do not have to do all the work of reading each paper and synthesizing it myself. So each of these different sorts of papers might have value to me. But if it's only a local study of a particular forest of interest, well, that might appeal to me as an individual if it happens to be my local forest, but it's not something that will broadly interest people from around the world. But these other categories of new ideas or studies that explain dynamics of forests in large regional areas or review papers, these are all topics that are guaranteed to be of interest to a very large number of readers around the world. So a new idea that I could use, an example might be technologies that will reduce the problems with pests and pathogens in eucalyptus plantations. Eucalyptus plantations occur around the world in the warmer parts of the world, and it's easy to imagine that technologies for reducing the problems with insects and diseases would be of broad interest to many people. Another example would be monitoring biodiversity. This is a situation where I may not be living in Canada, I may not work in Canadian forests, but in fact the experience of Canadian colleagues might be very useful to me in my home forest of figuring out how I'd like to do some monitoring locally. So if we want to publish a paper that's going to be strong and of great interest to many people, we might start by asking, well, how big is the effect of something? If I thin the forest, how big is the effect on growth of the next 5 years? Or if I add nitrogen fertilizer, how big is the effect going to be? Well, we might ask that question, but it might be a more interesting question if we ask, how much is the effect going to vary if we go from one location to another location? Because then we have not only information about the response, but we have some more insight about why the response is large in some areas and small in other areas. A study that explains dynamics in many places, well, in statistics we would call this a study that has a large population of inference. We often teach our students in statistics that we want to design experiments. The first thing we tell them is that, well, what is the area you want to say something about? And then we design a sampling scheme that samples that area very nicely and honorably without bias, and then we take the information from the sample and we apply it back to a population of inference. Well, I want to explain why this population of inference is something we teach our students, but we have not always paid as much attention to it as scientists as perhaps we should have. So here's an example. Let's ask, how do nitrogen-fixing trees change the amount of soil nitrogen that will then be available for the sustained productivity of a forest? It happens to be a favorite topic of mine from long ago. So here we might have a stand of nitrogen-fixing leguminous trees, Facultaria, and we might have a stand next to it of eucalyptus trees, which will not fix nitrogen, and then we might sample the soil beneath them and see how much nitrogen is accumulated. We might choose a location like the island of Hawaii, and we might have one plot of the nitrogen-fixing legume and one plot of eucalyptus. We measure the soil nitrogen and we say the difference between them means that the nitrogen fixing tree has increased soil nitrogen by 36 grams per square meter each year. But you know, those two plots may not have been exactly identical before we chose to plant one species on one plot and the other species on the other plot. It could be that what we think is our effect of the nitrogen fixing tree is actually an effect that was pre-existing in the soil, and so we call this an unreplicated study. It does not mean that the number 36 is the wrong number. It just means I should not be statistically confident that it's a nitrogen fixing effect. So classically we would say this is not a replicated study. So here's the kind of design that shows up very often in forest studies and agronomy studies and many kinds of investigations around the world. It's called a randomized block design. Here we have 4 different blocks across a hillside perhaps, and we randomly choose which species goes in which plot so that we have one of each in each block. And then we might come up with a number for the nitrogen change in the soil. In this case, it was 18 grams per square meter per year. And this is a design that lets us have confidence that whatever effect we're saying the trees have, it's not just a pre-existing difference in the soil that our experiment fell on top of. It is, in fact, something that we can evaluate whether it was a random effect or not a random effect. And we have a very significant increase in nitrogen. So we call this replicated, and we think it's a good design, but I'm going to suggest that perhaps it's not as strong a design as we might wish. And it's not so strong because, again, we have to come back to this population of inference. So how far could we take the results of this experiment statistically and apply it somewhere else? We did this study at this one location on the island of Hawaii, but could we go 20 kilometers away and have confidence that this nitrogen fixing tree would increase soil nitrogen by 18 grams per square meter per year? Well, we didn't have an opportunity to sample the soil that happens to be 20 kilometers away, and so statistically that site 20 kilometers away is outside the population of inference for our replicated design, and so statistically we have no opportunity to say whether or not the results would apply up there. We have no opportunity to say if the results would apply over there. And so the replicates were all nested in one site of a few hectares, and our population of inference then, statistically speaking, is only a few hectares, so it's not the strongest design that we might apply in developing our research questions and answers. And if we go to other islands where the soils might be older and the rainfall might be very different, we probably will have a different effect on the soil nitrogen if we have this tree combination. And again, if it's outside of our population of inference, we don't have statistical ways of understanding the probability of getting a particular outcome. So outside the population of inference means we can't say anything with statistics. Now, I might believe that nitrogen-fixing trees always do the same thing everywhere all the time. Well, then I can extrapolate to another island and I can be confident. Well, I can be confident in my opinion, but I can't back up my opinion with statistical inference. So, maybe an experimental outcome would apply to other places, but you know, geographically, the soils change, the climate changes, the weeds that might grow with the trees change, and all these things often matter a lot in forests. And if they matter a lot, and yet we leave them out of our experimental design, well then we're guaranteeing that the population of inference for a replicated study might be too small to be of very much use around the planet, or even around the island, or even across the hillside. So, the next kind of question that we might want to ask is one that I think is particularly good, and that is asking not only how big some number was when we have a treatment, but why the effect happened the way that it did. And so why does the effect occur, and why does it vary from one place to another? If we can ask that kind of question and get some answers to it, that's when the readers will have great power in taking the knowledge from our research projects and applying them to some other situation and some other time. So something that I suggest to students is thinking not just of a hypothesis that predicts what will happen, that nitrogen will increase under the presence of nitrogen-fixing trees, but turn that hypothesis into a why-pothesis. And so that would be something like saying that nitrogen fixation by the tree will enrich the soil more when soil phosphorus happens to be high, because the nitrogen fixing trees require more phosphorus than other trees. So I always would like to suggest that combining an idea, an experiment, with a why hypothesis that explains why something ought to be expected, and then testing that hypothesis, is perhaps the strongest way to have value to readers of scientific papers. Here's an example that I think is a good illustration that I've used recently in Finland, and this was looking at why the forests of Finland are growing better. Now, the authors of this paper could have had a title, "The Forests of Finland Are Growing Faster," but they wanted to emphasize for readers that they want to understand the reasons why the forest is growing faster, and so that even their title shows the why hypothesis. They're expecting climatic warming is explaining the growth of the trees in Finland. That makes it much more interesting for readers. It's not just about increasing growth in Finland, it's about how climate and growth come together, which will interest people around the world. And here's something where they wanted to be clear about their population of inference. Finland is a fairly sizable country, but compared to the world, it's not all that big. But if we take the size of Finland, and then on that green area that's drawn around the northern hemisphere, that's the area where the authors think that their results might also apply. They're not saying that their population of inference goes that far. Statistically, they can only talk about Finland. But in fact, they can tell us that they think their results may well apply to vast forests of the boreal regions of the planet. And what I like about this is the authors told us very clearly what their population of inference was, the country of Finland, and they showed us different zones, but then also where they think we might make use of the information that they came up with. So a clear population of inference, and then they're telling us how we might extrapolate beyond that, but they're not mixing up the two. One, they can give us statistical ideas, and the other, they can give us a representative idea that they think will be useful to us. So any study that has a larger population of inference is likely to be of more value to potential readers. But sometimes, in fact, most papers that we find published don't always tell us what the population of inference might be. They may have this idea as authors in their minds, but they assume the readers will understand this. Well, in many cases, you'll do the readers a favor if you tell them very clearly, here's the population of inference, here is how we then sampled it to get an honorable representation of our population of inference, and then it's very clear and very simple how to apply the data back to saying something about the large area that was the subject of the study. So I mentioned that we can also have an interesting paper that would be a review of many studies, and here are a couple of examples. A global overview of drought and heat-induced mortality. Well, if it's a global overview, that's going to be quite easy for people to want to read this and get knowledge perhaps from 30 or 50 papers that other authors have written, but it's all condensed into one paper that has the insights connected among all those original pieces of science. This is very helpful to readers who don't have time to read and synthesize all the literature on their own. So review papers are really useful for our readers. Another one would be Contemporary Forest Restoration, a review emphasizing function. Wherever I may want to restore a forest, it may not be a place where anyone's done forest restoration work before, but if I come to this review, I can learn in one place what others have already learned, and I can see where I might want to go in the literature to read original research that might be of use to me very locally. So review papers are often of great interest, and if you have a chance to write one, it's a good way to reach out and provide a service to readers around the world. Well, it seems like perhaps I'm not very happy with studies that occur at only one site with a population of inference of only a few hectares. But it turns out that if we have enough of those, we might be able to put those together in a review of sorts and perhaps even do a formal meta-analysis where we ask, anytime anyone has put a nitrogen-fixing tree on soil, what has happened to the nitrogen content of the soil? And in this meta-analysis, it shows that on average, about 7 grams of nitrogen come and accumulate in the soil on each square meter each year. Sometimes it's more than that, sometimes less, but the average is about 7. And you might notice that there are no values that are less than 2, none are 0, and there are no cases where nitrogen-fixing trees have somehow removed nitrogen out of the soil. There are no negative values there. Well, this is an important thing to realize when we do these meta-analyses, because it could be that if I do a study, I find nitrogen-fixing trees enrich the soil, I can get that published pretty easily. If I do a study and I say, whoa, the nitrogen-fixing trees did not increase the nitrogen in the soil, it turns out it's hard to publish negative results, as we call them. But it's very important in a meta-analysis that those representative studies include the ones that were 0 or maybe even negative. And in my own career, I find it's easy to publish positive values, but I had a wonderful study that was stronger than some of my other studies, but I had negative values, and I could not get that published in 3 different journals. So if you ever have negative values and observations, you expect a big effect and nothing happens, and the reviewers say, well, this is not interesting, nothing happened, feel free to argue with those reviewers and with the editor and say that negative results in science are fundamentally important, maybe not as exciting as positive results, but they're very important to our science and understanding the world around us. Well, those are just a few comments I'd like to start with about how to design strong experiments that will then set you up well for writing strong scientific papers. Now I'd like to move on to how to write these strong papers and using our Journal of Forest Ecology and Management as an example. We might start by asking, why do you want to publish? And of course, everyone knows why you need to publish, but maybe it's worth being explicit about it too. One reason we want to publish papers is that we want to get credit for our brilliant ideas. If you're like me, you may have one brilliant idea in your life, or maybe not even one, but if you have a brilliant idea, you want to get credit for it. And so by publishing a paper in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, we document where ideas came from originally. It gives us credit for our creativity. Now, we might be coming up with an idea that we think is very revolutionary and novel, but our peers may be skeptical about it. Well, if we publish a paper with lots of details in it, well, then our peers are able to go out and replicate this study and see if they can get the same result or not. So without publication, it would be difficult for our peers to really have an independent chance to corroborate or contradict the results of our experiment. But we also don't do these scientific experiments just for our own satisfaction. We want to share. Just like young children in school, we want to share when something exciting happens to us. We want to share this with the world, and our colleagues who read the literature are the only people in the world who are going to care about what we've just done. So publishing is a good way to enthusiastically share the excitement you have at what you have found out about the forests of the world. And then finally, peer review. We might view peer review as an obnoxious thing where we write our best paper, we send it off, and here are these outside people telling us that we must fix the paper because it's not good enough. That may not feel good, but if it's a good review, those reviewers actually give us insights that help us improve the paper and increase the value of this paper for the readers that will ultimately come to find it online or in a library. And so the review process not only helps editors discern which papers will be the strongest ones to publish, the review process, when it works well, also helps the authors create a much better product for communicating science. Well, there are also some other roles of scientific publications that may be worth listing here, and I won't go through and read all of them. But registration to let people know when the scientific event happened, certify that, yes, this is something that the world should listen to. It's not just some quack coming up with an idea that deserves no confidence from anyone at all. And it provides a way to share, as I mentioned, which is a big opportunity that satisfies us as scientists. But I also want to mention that it helps us preserve the knowledge over time. I've always been fascinated about when a certain idea in forestry came along. And because we have published literature, it's possible to go back in time and find out what people were thinking in different decades, and then try to see how ideas have developed over time. And without the archival role of literature, we wouldn't be able to figure out where this idea came from and when. When you want to plan an article, you want to always write a very strong article. And the thing that is most important, of course, is having a very clear message that will be useful to readers. And when you have a good message and it's going to be useful to readers, what really comes next is how well do you tell a story? We might think that when we're doing science, we're doing statistics, we're doing lab analyses, but when it comes time to write your paper, you become a storyteller. You become a storyteller like the author of the Harry Potter series. Well, you can't make up things as you go, of course, but you really have to tell that story in a way that appeals to the interests of your readers and then informs them about those questions that you raised and then leads them to have continuing curiosity in the field of science of the interest that you share with them. So the editors, the reviewers, and the readers all want to have well-crafted stories that tell us about your science projects. Choosing a journal becomes important when you only have a certain number of papers you'll probably produce in your career. And which journal do you choose for which one of your papers? They're very dear to you, so you want to choose a journal wisely. The reputation of a journal is something important because that has a lot to do with where your paper will be found by the readers that you would like to read your paper. What will be the audience that this journal will come to? You want to use a journal where the reviewing process works well. It does not always find that every paper deserves to be published, but at least the quality of the reviews are insightful and will help improve the papers that come along. Something that's become very important in the modern world is this reviewing process ought to be relatively speedy. In the old days, it would take us 1 to 2 years between the time an author submits a paper and the time it shows up in the libraries. Now it's common to have a first decision about a paper in 6 weeks or 8 weeks, or sometimes if it takes a while, maybe 10 weeks. So we don't want to deal with journals that are still stuck in the 20th century and think that, well, 6 months or a year is okay to get back to our authors. And then you might consider impact factors, how much papers are cited in one journal or another. This doesn't always help science a lot because the high-impact journals often have broad readerships, but the high impacts may be because they're dealing with biomedical papers as well as ecological forest papers. Well, the forestry papers may not be cited as much as the medicinal papers are cited. But if you're working for a dean or an administrator who can only count and really can't evaluate your career any way than the citation factor of your journals, you might want to think about these impact factors of journals. But really for me, I always want to go for where will the audience that I'd like to reach be found. So when it comes time for you to choose, especially early in a career, which journal to think of, your colleagues, your thesis supervisor are probably your best choices for getting insights. And if you don't have that available to you, you could also just look at the papers you put in your reference list at the end of your paper, and the journals that appear most frequently in the reference list might be reaching the right audience for your paper. When it's time to prepare your manuscript, all the journals will have a guide for authors that you find online. And it makes sense to download that and work through it and submit your paper in the format that the journal is asking. That sounds like something I probably shouldn't have to mention, but in fact we get a fair number of papers where the authors really have not paid much attention to what the journal would like. They'll send us a paper that's really not relevant for the aims and scope of the journal, or it really isn't well suited for us at all. So that's not a big deal, but I thought I would mention as we go by. The titles are something that are your opportunity to bring in the readers you hope will read your paper. And if you want to bring in readers, it turns out a long title is probably not necessary to hook someone's interest. You can probably hook the interest of a prospective reader with a very simple phrase. Informative, which species you are looking at or which question you're asking. But really, the shorter the title that captures the essential pieces, the more likely the reader will be to grab this paper and devour it. If you have a long title with lots of words, people just don't always have the patience for getting to the end of a title. And if you can avoid technical jargon, that's very nice. If everyone in the world knows what Korean white pine is, well then in the title you can say Korean white pine if that is your subject. But if everyone in the world may not know what Korean white pine is, well then you might want to use the Latin name in the title, but you probably don't need to put both of them in the title. Now the abstract could have both of them because that would be useful, but in the title you should probably just choose what your readers need to know in order to recognize this is a paper I would like to read. You can read a few points here about abstracts, but the one I'd like to stress is that an abstract that is not useful to readers is one that says, we examined these 3 different things in these 3 different kinds of forests. Well, that just sets up the reader to think, well, okay, but a good abstract not only tells the readers what was going to be examined, but it gives the results as well. We will usually have 5 or 10 times more people reading abstracts of our papers than will read the whole paper. So we want to inform those readers who see only the abstract. And the abstract even is a useful summary for those who read the entire paper, pulling out those major points of interest. So good abstracts always include numbers. They always tell us what the results were. They don't just give us an outline of the subjects that will be covered in the paper that follows. Writing the introduction of a paper is your chance to secure the interest of a reader. Throwing out the title that's very interesting is like putting out bait for a fish, but then it's the introduction that really hooks that fish and brings that fish in to read the entire paper. That may not be the best analogy, but we want to bring people in to read the paper, and the introduction is the way that we really hook that interest. It provides the context for the paper, so we'll often start out with some kind of big context in which our research was designed. And then we want to zero in and get narrower as we go into the introduction about the exact problem we were dealing with. And then we identify what our objectives were, what our hypothesis might be. And if we're lucky, we'll even include a hypothesis. And it's important that each article we write have a different introduction, because if it's exactly the same introduction, well then we don't think there should be 2 separate papers. For the introduction to work for a particular paper, it ought to be tailored for exactly that paper. One thing I'd like to mention about this funnel approach, where we start with the broad context and we come down to our narrow research project, is that at the end of the paper, we want to sort of take that funnel and turn it back around again. So for example, if we say that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing, forests are very important in the carbon balance of the planet, and I, in my local forest, examine the role of my understory vegetation in changing the carbon in my soil. This is a common form of an introduction we might find in a forestry paper, but then at the end I want them to turn around and say, I found that the soil carbon change by my understory was so large that it influenced the carbon budget of my whole forest, and my forest is so important that it changes the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere. Well, of course, that's not the case. So if the reason you wanted to look at the understory vegetation was to understand the soil effect of that understory vegetation, you really cannot say that the justification is the global carbon budget, because there's no way that your small study can actually inform us about the global carbon budget. Anytime you start the context of your study, you're going to be obligated at the end to come back and then say, my study tells me something about this big context that I started this with in my introduction. So there are many reasons understory vegetation and soils are important, and it's not just because of the global carbon budget. And so the context should focus on why it really would be important to you to investigate this area. The methods, we simply write down what we did, of course. Except we don't actually write down every little detail of what we did. We have to decide how much information do we need to give so that someone might understand our design and perhaps even repeat it in her own forest if she wanted to. But we also want to be clear in the methods what we're doing with our experimental design, and not just list the statistics, but say, for example, what the population of inference was. And then once we know the population of which you'd like to say something, then we understand how your sampling scheme that you chose either is very valid for that population of inference or how it really was not strong enough for that. Another point that perhaps should not have to be said, but when we're writing a paper, sometimes we might forget it, and that is that if you have a hypothesis at the bottom of your introduction, which is a very good thing to have, it's very nice to, in your results section coming later, say if your hypothesis was supported or not. And if you're going to say your hypothesis was supported or not in the results section, well, in the methods section, you might want to tell us what outcome goes which way for your hypothesis. So if you have a hypothesis in the introduction, you might mention it in the methods as well, and then, of course, in the results. So the results should always tie back to the objectives, the reasons why you are doing the study that you've chosen to spend so much of your time and energy doing. And then, let's see, if we're telling a story in our results section, we don't necessarily want to put in everything we could possibly imagine, because then that's just like the memory of our computer stuffed full of things, but the story might be buried within all that information. And I would like to suggest that a virus crept into science writing in the 1960s mostly, but the virus has grown and grown and taken over scientific writing, and that's the P virus. In science writing, we often want to say, what is the odds that I have my outcome? And it was only a random effect that came along, and it's not really the effect of my hypothesized mechanisms. So statistics are very good, but when it comes to telling a story, if we put in lots of p-values or even f-values or other things inside the sentences that we use to tell our story, that's like interrupting your favorite television show with a commercial that gets in the way of the continuity of your story. You may have important statistics to relate, but that's why we have tables or figures to put in our papers. When we're writing sentences, it's good enough to say that the effect of my treatment was highly significant. We don't have to necessarily give a p-value, because back in our methods section, we probably said that if a p-value is greater than a certain level, then we'll say that this is accepted as not a random effect. So in our methods section, we can talk about what statistics lead us to accept or reject a hypothesis, but then every sentence that comes later does not have to include it. If you think there's value, you can throw it into a table. But remember, you're telling a story with your sentences, and the more parenthetical references to p-values you throw in, the harder it is for readers to understand your best stories. So now I want to go through a little bit of the process of deciding, how do we tell a story? Well, we might have a table like this that tells the story of how the productivity of eucalyptus plantations in Brazil changed over time. We have 1986 through 2009. We have a mean annual increment, and then we have a couple different measures of variability. If I put this in a research paper, the story may not be really clear. What I'd be asking of readers is for the readers to tell their own story using these ingredients. It would be like going to a bakery and wanting a cake, and then someone hands you all the ingredients and says, go ahead and bake your own cake. Figure it out yourself. So of course, we want to figure out, when is a table like this useful, and what should go in that table anyway? Would you really want to put standard deviations in there, or would you want to put in a coefficient of variation? Would you want to put in standard errors of the mean? There are different ways to express the variability of data, and so you want to be careful that you've chosen a particular approach for a reason. And in fact, we might give a whole bunch of standard deviations, one for each year, as I've got in this table. But in fact, maybe the standard deviation doesn't change a lot from one year to the next, and then our strongest estimate of variability around the population would be a pooled one that went across all the years. But if the standard deviation across the years was changing, well then maybe we don't want to pool and have a single standard deviation estimate. So all this is complicated when we look at this table. But if we start looking at a graph instead, we can get much clearer information in the story that we would like our readers to come away with. So here's the same information, and we simply have the years again on the x-axis, and on the y-axis it's the mean annual increment. And then we have all these different points in time advancing, showing clearly that we have increasing growth over time. And then we have those variation bars around it, and if we're very astute, we might notice the variation bars are getting smaller as we go along. This forest company is learning how to be very consistent in growing trees, not only making them grow faster, but having greater consistency across the landscape as time goes on. Now, sometimes when people put in a graph like this, instead of that yellow line, they'll put in a blue line. So the blue line actually tracks the data. One year might be slightly higher than another, and then it might come down the next year and then back up the year after that. But if the story is what's happening over time on the scale of a decade or two, that year-to-year variation is what we might think of as noise. And so if you connect all the dots jagged up and down, what you're telling the readers is that the change from one year to the next is pretty much all signal, and it's not noise, and therefore the real trend is a jagged one. But if you want to look at the effect of time as a variable, well then we got the signal, but there's also noise because one year is not the same as another year. And in that case, we want the yellow line, which plots the story, not the noise. It plots the signal, not the signal plus the noise. Well, here's another version of the data. It doesn't quite go as far back in time, and sometimes authors will show a dot graph like this. But then, of course, readers will either plot the line in their own minds, or the authors will show them what the best fit line would be. If you want the readers to have to tell the story themselves, you can leave that line out. But if you want to help the readers understand the story quickly and clearly, well then putting the line in is helpful. Now in this previous graph, I mentioned that these variability bars get smaller as time goes on. Well, if that's a story you want to tell, this graph does not tell it really as strongly as it might. This graph, on the other hand, simply takes that variability measure and it shows very explicitly that there's been a strong decline in variability across the landscape as time goes on. So as a storyteller, you get to decide what information is really going to be useful to my readers, and if you want to show them the variability across the landscape has changed, this graph on the bottom here is so much stronger than the one I started with. It's the same information, but it's telling the story more clearly so that readers cannot miss the point that the authors think is really fascinating. So here is a statement that could be put into a scientific paper, and I would say that it is lame. Lame is an English word that means it cannot move very well. It's incapable of being very effective. So the growth of pines was influenced by the size of neighboring aspen trees. I think this is not a good way to tell a story because, well, it tells me there was an effect, but it doesn't even tell me if the growth of pines was increased or decreased by the aspen trees. So here's a better version, but I would say that it's still lame. The growth of pines was influenced by the size of neighboring aspens, and now I give an R² value. But I still don't know if it was a positive or a negative effect. And an R² value of 0.4, well, maybe a random assembly of data could give me an R² of 0.4. I'd want to have some idea of whether that's something to be confident about. So here's another version, but I'm still going to say this is a lame thing to write in a paper. The growth of pines was influenced by the size of neighboring aspens, and now we have a p-value, so we know that that association is probably not just a random association. There's probably something else going on. But this is still not a very good statement. Okay, here's more details, but it's still not a strong story. The growth of the pines decreased with increasing size of neighboring aspens. Now that tells me the direction of the effect. If you were a reader, though, and this effect was maybe a 2% change in pine growth with a huge change in neighboring aspens, why would you care? But if a small change in the neighboring aspens gave a huge change in pine growth, well, then you'd be very excited as a reader. And so here's a much simpler statement that is really telling the story in a way the readers will appreciate. The growth of pines decreased as the size of the neighbors got bigger. A 10% increase in aspen lowered the pine growth by 15%. Now, there are no other statistics here other than this single example of the size of the effect. Now, there might be some statistics that would show up in a table or a graph later, but the readers already know what p-value you established in your methods section that you would accept for supporting your hypothesis or rejecting it. So you don't have to say significant, you don't have to say R², you don't have to do anything here. Unless, of course, you really wanted to say the variability around the relationship was incredibly tight. Well, if that's a story you want to tell, then it deserves its own sentence. But if that's not part of your story, well, then this sentence captures the main effect for your readers. I'm just using this as an example to say you need to be very clear about what features of your story will be most interesting to your readers, and then write the paper to make sure that story comes out bright and clear. So, the priority of values for the readers that will come to your paper, the thing that will be of most use for them is whether your basic idea was accepted or rejected. If the readers could know only one thing from you, that would be it. If they could know two things, they'd like to know whether or not the effect of your treatment was large or whether it was small. So the size of the effect is the second thing that readers would like to make sure that they understand. After that, they'd like to know if there was in fact a pattern, how variable was the effect of the treatment. And that would be something that an R-squared or something similar to that would often capture for us. So that becomes interesting as well. And then only after all this is understood, then they'd like to know whether or not that might have been a random pattern, or should it really not be thought of as a random, and we should begin to have confidence that it was an important feature of the forest that we studied. I'm sorry if those, well, I guess that's sort of readable, but I like the picture of the lizard so much I thought he'd make a good background whether it showed up well or not. So, when it comes time to tell your story in the prose or the sentences, the farther down this list you go, the less important that is to put into the description, the more those details go in the tables or the graphs. But you want to be sure to focus your story in this sequence so you get the priorities right for telling the story, and then the tables and the graphs can handle the statistical details later. Okay, now we come to the discussion, and this is your opportunity to put into play the bigger picture that your science fits into. It could be that you want to go through and discuss each of the 8 different points you made in the results, but if you do that, readers aren't always going to remember any one of them if you try to ask them to digest 8 things. But if you pick 2 or 3 ideas that you think are particularly interesting and connect your study to those 2 or 3 ideas, well, the probability of the readers remembering that is really much higher. So a discussion section is not where you say everything you can think about in relation to your results. It's where you have a chance to connect to the bigger picture, but only show usually 2 or 3 connections, and that is the way that you can tell the story in a way that stays with your readers. And if your paper is not a long one, it's fine to combine results and discussion together. It may be something that you find appealing to put as many references in the paper as you possibly could. And the reason you might do that is because you want to be sure you give credit to everyone who's had ideas like yours in the past. You want to refer readers to further opportunities to learn about the topics that you've mentioned in your paper. There might be lots of details in your methods that you want to refer the reader to in case the reader would like to find out more. But again, if you put in too many citations, that makes it hard to read the paper because it keeps getting interrupted by these commercials of the citations. And so it's really much better to write a paper with just the right amount of citations. When an idea is borrowed from another paper, you certainly need to cite that paper. But if there are 800 papers that have cited that idea, you don't want to cite all 800 of them, perhaps only the most recent one, or a review paper, or the original source of the idea. So you want to ask, if I left out that citation, would my paper really be weakened? And if the answer is yes, then keep it in. But the citation length is usually not more than 1/4 of the entire length of a paper, and it's often about 1/5 of the length of an entire paper. Sometimes manuscripts come in where half of the paper is citations, and that's usually not what readers need. The language that is used in writing a paper is a challenge for especially those who are not native speakers of the language that it's being written in. And for most of us in science around the world, English is the language we write our papers in, but it's not always the language you're most comfortable with. If we're fortunate, we have colleagues that are native English speakers and they can help us improve the language in our papers. There are also professional services available that we can hire to help us improve the quality of the language of our paper. For most journals, we don't insist that the quality of the English has to be exactly as perfect as a native speaker would be able to write. But on the other hand, it does have to be quite good and clear so that it does not get in the way of communicating a clear story. And so we certainly want to encourage people to improve the quality of their English as best they can, but we really don't want the level of English, as long as it's good enough, to prevent a paper from becoming published. Responsibilities of authors, I just want to mention a few things as we go through. You can read all this on websites, journals have much of this information available, but the people who are authors on a paper should be able to stand up here and answer questions about what that research project was about. Sometimes people are put on as authors out of courtesy or because we use someone's laboratory or they provided some funding, but they really couldn't answer questions about the project. Well, those are the people that really deserve to be acknowledged very gratefully in the acknowledgement section, but those are not the people who should really be the authors. The authors have responsibilities. The first one is, of course, reporting only real results, only real data, and always a very honest approach. Removing outliers, sometimes that makes good sense in science, but if we ever have a variety of data and there's some outliers we'd like to remove, it's always important to tell readers that outliers were removed. Or perhaps to leave them in, show what the pattern was, and then take them out and say why you took them out and show what the improved pattern was. That way the readers are always ready to have confidence that you're being an honest author and they can take you seriously. Publishing ethics. Plagiarism is something that happens, whether it's increasing or not around the world is hard to say, but it's always important to say things in your own words. Now, it may be you read a paper in English, and English is not your native language, and in the methods section, they say it so eloquently that you could not say it as well in your own English, and so you feel like it would be honoring the original authors to simply copy their methods and use it in your paper. Well, you may have honorable intentions, but that falls into the category of plagiarism. It's always important that the words that are used in a paper belong to the authors. Perhaps a sentence or two that you then credit to the original source is fine, but we can never have a paragraph that appears in one paper appear in another. If this is a topic that's not familiar to you, it's very important to read the journal web pages to make sure you understand what the concerns are. And then I just want to start finishing up by saying that once you've created this research paper that you hope the world will notice, there's some things you can do to help the world notice your project. One great innovation with electronic publishing is that it's very easy to have graphs inside our abstracts. In the old days, abstracts had no illustrations and we had only words to make our points. Now we can have images included in our abstracts that help us to tell our story. And in fact, we can even have audio files, and the modern publishing world gives us lots of opportunities to design a much more effective paper than mere words were allowing us to do in decades before. When you come to conferences, you have an opportunity to network and pass around copies of your paper or abstracts from your paper, because at a conference like this is the wonderful opportunity you have to find other people in the world who are excited about your favorite topics. And if you can't do it at a conference, there are all kinds of systems now available for networking out in the real world. And we hope that you'll be designing strong research projects, you'll be writing up exciting stories for us that are well presented and honorably presented, and we hope that at least some of them will appear in Forest Ecology and Management. Thank you.